In October 2019, I drove up to our family's old hunting lodge in the Adirondack Mountains for what I thought would be a peaceful weekend of genealogy research. My name is Rutherford Pemberton, though most folks call me Ford. At 54, I just retired from my position as an insurance executive, and my wife Margaret had been encouraging me to finally explore the property that had been in our family for over a century. The lodge sits on 200 acres of dense wilderness about 40 miles north of Albany. My great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Pemberton, built it in 1887 as a hunting retreat, but family stories always hinted at something more significant about the land. My grandfather used to tell me that Cornelius chose that particular spot because he'd found what he called Indian stones, remnants of some ancient settlement that predated any European presence in the region. The drive up was spectacular. October in the Adirondacks is pure magic, with maple and oak trees blazing in reds and golds against the deep green of pine forests. The two-lane highway wound through valleys and over ridges, past small lakes that reflected the autumn sky like mirrors. I'd rented a sturdy SUV for the trip, knowing the old logging road to the lodge could be rough. As I turned off the main highway onto what locals call Pemberton Road, named after our family's long presence in the area, the pavement gave way to gravel, then to little more than packed dirt with grass growing down the middle. The canopy overhead grew thicker, filtering the afternoon sunlight into a golden-green twilight, even though it was only 3 o'clock. The lodge appeared suddenly around a bend, exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. It was a massive log structure, 3 stories tall with a steep metal roof and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Shutters hung at odd angles, and the steps creaked ominously under my weight as I approached the front door. The key was where it had always been, hidden under a loose board on the porch railing. Inside, the lodge felt like stepping back in time. Heavy wooden furniture covered in dust sheets filled the main room, and the stone fireplace dominated one wall. Mounted deer heads gazed down with glassy eyes, and the air smelled of old wood, leather, and something else, something earthy and ancient that I couldn't quite identify. I spent the first day settling in and organizing my research materials. I'd brought copies of old family documents, land deeds, and a metal detector I'd purchased specifically for this trip. The documents told an interesting story. Cornelius hadn't simply bought this land from the state. He'd acquired it from a Mohawk elder named Joseph Crow Feather in what appeared to be some kind of ceremonial exchange rather than a traditional sale. That evening, I built a fire and spread the old papers across the dining table. One document particularly caught my attention, a hand-drawn map in Cornelius's spidery handwriting showing the lodge property with various landmarks marked. Most were ordinary: the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, the old growth pine grove to the south, the rocky outcropping that offered views of the valley below. But there was one marking that intrigued me, a small circle northwest of the lodge, maybe half a mile into the forest, with the notation, CF Sacred Ground, leave undisturbed. The initials almost certainly referred to Crow Feather, and I wondered what my ancestor had found there that was important enough to mark on his personal map. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost coating the wooden deck outside my bedroom window. After a quick breakfast of coffee and energy bars, I loaded my day pack with water, the metal detector, my smartphone for photos, and some basic tools. The GPS on my phone showed my location clearly, though I noticed the signal was already weaker here than in town. Following Cornelius's map, I headed northwest from the lodge, crossing the creek on a fallen log that had probably served as a bridge for decades. The forest here was old growth, massive pines and oaks that had never felt an axe, their trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. The understory was relatively clear, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that crunched softly under my hiking boots. The metal detector proved more sensitive than I'd expected. Within the first 20 minutes, it was beeping constantly at old nails, bottle caps, and what appeared to be fragments of rusted farm equipment. I was beginning to think this would be a futile exercise when I crested a small ridge and saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 yards ahead, the forest opened into a natural clearing, perhaps 30 feet across. At its center stood a ring of weathered stone pillars, each about 4 feet tall and covered with what looked like carved symbols. Even from a distance, I could see that this wasn't some random rock formation. These stones had been deliberately placed and shaped by human hands. As I approached the circle, my metal detector began emitting a steady, urgent beeping. The sound was different from the intermittent chirps it had made earlier. This was continuous and insistent. I switched it off and walked into the circle, feeling an immediate change in the atmosphere. The air seemed thicker somehow, and despite the bright morning sunshine, the temperature felt noticeably cooler within the ring of stones. The symbols carved into the stones were unlike anything I'd seen before. They weren't the pictographs I'd expected from Mohawk culture, but something far older and more primitive. Spirals, angular lines, and shapes that might have been animals or human figures covered each pillar. Some of the carvings were so weathered they were barely visible, suggesting an age that predated European contact by centuries, maybe millennia. I spent nearly an hour photographing each stone from multiple angles, my excitement growing with each shot. This was exactly the kind of discovery that genealogy enthusiasts dream about, a genuine connection to the deep history of our family land. But as I worked, that strange heaviness in the air seemed to intensify. Birds that had been singing throughout my hike had gone completely silent. Even the wind had died, leaving the forest in an unnatural stillness. It was when I reached the center of the circle that my metal detector, despite being switched off, suddenly erupted in a cacophony of beeping. The digital display flickered wildly between readings before going completely black. I tapped the device and tried turning it on and off, but it remained dead. More disturbing was what I could smell now. A musky animal odor that reminded me of the reptile house at the zoo, but stronger and somehow more threatening. That's when I noticed the depression in the ground at the exact center of the stone circle. It was perhaps 3 feet across and maybe 18 inches deep, filled with what looked like deliberately placed river stones. But as I knelt down for a closer look, I realized these weren't just stones. Mixed among them were fragments of pottery, arrowheads, and what appeared to be pieces of bone that were definitely not animal in origin. My hands were shaking as I used a small trowel to carefully move some of the stones aside. Beneath them, wrapped in what remained of rotted hide, was a collection of artifacts that took my breath away. There were dozens of arrowheads made from black obsidian, pottery shards decorated with the same spiral patterns I'd seen on the stones, and several pieces of worked copper that might once have been ceremonial ornaments. But it was the skull that made me drop the trowel and scramble backward. It was clearly human, but there was something wrong with it. The proportions seemed off, the eye sockets too large, the jaw too pronounced. Arranged around it were what appeared to be the bones of hands, still wearing corroded copper bracelets. The rational part of my mind, the insurance executive who'd spent 30 years evaluating risks and evidence, told me I'd stumbled onto an important archaeological site. This was probably a Native American burial ground, exactly what Cornelius's map had indicated. The respectful thing to do would be to carefully cover everything back up and contact the appropriate authorities. But as I knelt there, staring at that misshapen skull, the forest around me began to change. The silence that had seemed merely unusual before now felt oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. More unsettling was the smell. That animal musk was getting stronger, mixed now with something that reminded me of burning hair. That's when I heard the drumming. It started as a faint rhythmic thumping, so low I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. The Itsubawabim sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone pillars in a way that made it impossible to locate its source. As the drumming grew louder, I became aware of something else, a low chanting or singing in a language I didn't recognize, weaving in and out of the drum rhythm like smoke. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, and looked around the circle. The forest beyond the stones seemed darker now, as if shadows were gathering, despite the bright October sun overhead. My phone showed no signal at all, and when I tried to take a photo of the burial site, the camera app wouldn't open. The device felt ice cold in my hands. The drumming grew louder, more insistent, and I began to hear other sounds mixed in with it. What might have been footsteps circling the stone ring, always just out of sight among the trees. The animal smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. Whatever was out there was getting closer. I've never considered myself a particularly superstitious man. 30 years in insurance teaches you to deal in facts and probabilities, not folklore and ghost stories. But standing in that ancient circle, surrounded by sounds that shouldn't exist and smells that belonged to no creature I knew, I felt a primal fear that cut through all my rational thinking. I quickly but carefully replaced the artifacts and bones, covering them back up with the river stones. My hands moved frantically, driven by an overwhelming certainty that I needed to restore everything exactly as I'd found it. The drumming reached a crescendo as I placed the last stone, then stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. For a moment, everything returned to normal. Birds began singing again. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and the oppressive cold lifted. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees, and almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole experience. Altitude, maybe, or some kind of anxiety reaction to being alone in the wilderness. Then I saw the footprints. They circled the stone ring in the soft earth just beyond the pillars. Dozens of them, made by bare feet that were definitely human, but somehow wrong. Too long, with toes that extended like claws. The prints were fresh, pressed into ground that had been unmarked when I first entered the circle. I didn't run immediately. Even terrified, some part of me wanted to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that would help me make sense of this experience later. But when I tried to photograph the footprints, my phone screen went completely white, as if the camera was overexposed despite the forest shade. That's when I heard my name. Rutherford. The voice came from directly behind me, spoken in a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the clearing. It was my grandfather's voice, unmistakably, though he'd been dead for 15 years. When I spun around, there was nothing there but forest. No movement, no figure among the trees. "Rutherford, you shouldn't have come here." This time the voice came from my left, still my grandfather's, but with an urgency that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my day pack and started backing toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them, shapes moving among the shadows between the trees, keeping pace with me as I moved. They were human in outline, but wrong in every detail, too tall and moving with a fluid grace that no person should possess. As they stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, I caught glimpses of features that made my rational mind simply shut down. Elongated limbs, skin that seemed to shift and flow, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I ran then, crashing through the undergrowth with no thought except getting as far away from that place as possible. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving through the forest with impossible speed. Branches seemed to reach for me. Roots tried to catch my feet, and more than once I was certain I felt something brush against my back. The GPS on my phone was useless now, showing only static, but somehow I found my way back to the lodge through pure panic and instinct. I burst through the front door, slammed it behind me, and spent the next 10 minutes dragging furniture against it, while my heart hammered in my chest. I left that same afternoon, throwing my gear into the SUV and driving back to Albany without stopping once to look behind me. It wasn't until I was safely back in my suburban home, with Margaret fussing over my scratched face and torn clothes, that I began to question what had really happened in those woods. But I kept the photos I'd managed to take of the stone circle. And sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing them on my computer, I notice things in the background that I swear weren't there when I took the pictures. Shapes among the trees, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone else to disturb their ancient ground. I've never been back to the Pemberton Lodge, and I never will. Back in the summer of 1970, when I was 17 and thought I knew everything about the world, my friends and I had a place we called our own. It was the old baseball diamond behind the Millfield Steel Works, carved out of the Pennsylvania hillside 40 years before when the mill was booming and the town had money for such things. By our time, the mill was already showing cracks, laying off men every few months, and that field had been forgotten by everyone except us. The diamond sat in a clearing surrounded by thick pine woods, maybe half a mile from the main road through a dirt path that wound past rusted equipment and abandoned rail cars. Most folks avoided the area entirely. Too many reminders of better times, I suppose. But for me, Leland Hartwick, Clifford Morehouse, and Quentin Bellwether, it was perfect. Nobody bothered us there, and God knows we all needed a place where nobody bothered us. Lee was the natural leader of our group, tall and lean with calloused hands from working weekends at Muller's gas station. He had dreams bigger than Millfield could hold, talked constantly about California, about the ocean, about places where a man could make something of himself without his grandfather's failures hanging around his neck like a millstone. His family's farm was failing, had been failing since his daddy died in '68, and Lee carried that weight like he was personally responsible for saving them all. Cliff had it worse at home. His old man was a mean drunk who'd take a belt to him for breathing too loud, and his mother wasn't much better when she was hitting the cooking sherry. That boy would show up to our gatherings with fresh bruises, and nobody would say a word about it. That's just how things were then. The field was his sanctuary more than anyone's. Quentin kept us laughing, could tell a joke that would have you doubled over for minutes. He came from the only family among us that had any money. His father managed the bank, but he never acted superior about it. That summer, he'd been working at the mill for extra cash, learning the ropes from men who'd been there since the 20s. We'd meet at the field most summer evenings after supper, sitting on the weather-beaten bleachers that somehow still stood despite years of neglect. There was one light that still worked, an old sodium lamp that cast everything in an orange glow and attracted clouds of moths and June bugs. Beyond that small circle of light, the pine woods pressed in like a black wall. Sometimes, sitting there smoking cigarettes we'd bought with gas money, I'd get the strangest feeling we were being watched from those dark trees. The summer of 1970 was different from the start. There was tension in the air, not just the usual teenage restlessness, but something heavier. The war was dragging on. Boys we'd graduated with were coming home in boxes, or not coming home at all. The mill was cutting more shifts. Fathers were angry, mothers were worried, and we felt it, all pressing down on us, even when we tried to escape to our field. It was a Tuesday night in late June when everything changed. Lee and I had planned to meet up around 8 o'clock. He was going to show me a letter he'd gotten from a cousin in San Francisco who said there was work out there for anyone willing to learn. I got to the field first, parked my father's old Buick along the access road, and walked the quarter-mile through the trees. When I reached the clearing, Lee's beat-up Ford pickup was nowhere to be seen. That struck me as odd. Lee was never late, had been raised to believe that punctuality was a measure of a man's character. I figured maybe he'd gotten held up at home or the gas station, so I took my usual spot on the bleachers and lit a lucky strike to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The orange light buzzed and flickered overhead, and I found myself staring into the tree line more often than usual. There was something different about the darkness that night. It seemed deeper somehow, more alive. Twice I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but when I focused my attention, there was nothing but the gentle swaying of pine branches in the evening breeze. After 30 minutes, I was getting genuinely concerned. Lee wasn't the type to leave a friend hanging, especially not when he was excited about something like that California letter. I walked back to check the access road, thinking maybe I'd missed his truck in the gathering dusk, but the dirt path was empty except for tire tracks that could have been from anyone. That's when I heard it, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. Someone was whistling a tune I didn't recognize, something slow and melancholy that seemed to drift through the trees like smoke. It was coming from the direction of the old mill buildings, growing louder as whoever was making it came closer to the field. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back to my car and drive straight home. But 17-year-old boys don't always listen to good sense, especially when they're worried about a friend. Instead, I called out Lee's name, thinking maybe he was playing some kind of joke on me. The whistling stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the buzz of that old sodium light, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then I heard footsteps, not hurried or trying to be quiet, but deliberate, like someone taking a casual evening stroll. They were coming from the mill side of the woods, moving along the old service road that connected to our field. I stayed frozen on those bleachers, cigarette burning down to my fingers without me noticing. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards from where I sat in that orange pool of light. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out who was there, but the sodium lamp had ruined my night vision. "Evening, son." The voice was pleasant enough, middle-aged and unhurried. Beautiful night for sitting out under the stars. A man emerged from the shadows, and something about him immediately set my teeth on edge. He was average height, maybe 45 or 50, wearing work clothes that had seen better days. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and he had the kind of mustache that had been fashionable 20 years earlier. But it was his smile that bothered me most, too wide, too friendly for a stranger appearing out of nowhere in the dark. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, moving closer to the bleachers with that same casual stride. "My friend's supposed to be here," I managed, surprised my voice didn't crack. "Lee Hartwick. You seen him around?" The man's smile grew even wider. "Can't say I have. Of course, lots of young folks come and go around here. Hard to keep track of them all." Something about the way he said it made my stomach clench. This man didn't belong here. I knew every adult in Millfield, and I'd never seen him before in my life. Yet he talked like he'd been watching our field for a long time. "I work maintenance over at the mill," he continued, as if reading my thoughts. "Name's Virgil Thorne. Been keeping an eye on this place. Make sure kids aren't getting into trouble or hurting themselves on the old equipment." That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Mill maintenance workers didn't patrol abandoned baseball fields at night, and something in his eyes didn't match the friendly tone of his voice. They were too bright, too focused, like a cat watching a mouse hole. "Well, I should probably head home," I said, standing up and grinding my cigarette under my heel. "If you see Lee, tell him I was looking for him." "Oh, I wouldn't worry about Lee," Virgil Thorne said, and began to whistle that same haunting tune I'd heard earlier. As he whistled, he started to move, not walking exactly, but something between a skip and a dance, his arms swaying in rhythm with the melody. I'd never seen anything like it. Here was a grown man, dancing alone under a streetlight in an abandoned ball field, and the pure wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't someone having a good time or celebrating something. This was the behavior of a person whose mind had come loose from its moorings. "I really need to go," I said, backing toward the path to the access road. But Virgil Thorne wasn't paying attention to me anymore. He'd moved to the pitcher's mound and was spinning in slow circles, his whistling growing louder and more complex. In the orange light, his shadow seemed to writhe and dance independently of his body. I ran, not jogging or walking quickly. I ran like my life depended on it, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling over roots in my haste to reach my father's Buick. Behind me, that whistling continued, now joined by a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to follow me through the trees. When I reached the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine turned over, I glanced back toward the field and saw that orange glow flickering through the pine branches. The whistling had stopped, but somehow that was worse than hearing it. I drove straight home and told my parents I wasn't feeling well. For 3 days, I couldn't bring myself to call Lee or any of the other boys. When I finally worked up the courage to contact the Hartwicks, Lee's mother told me something that turned my blood to ice water. Lee had never made it home from work that Tuesday night. His truck had been found abandoned on Route 18, keys still in the ignition, no sign of where he'd gone. The state police were calling it a runaway situation. Said boys his age sometimes just took off for the big city without telling anyone. But I knew better. I knew Lee would never abandon his mother and sisters, never leave without saying goodbye to his friends. And I knew, with the terrible certainty that comes with witnessing something unnatural, that Virgil Thorne held the answers to what had happened. The problem was proving it. When I went to Sheriff Caldwell with my story, he listened politely, but explained that the mill had no employee named Virgil Thorne. They'd never had anyone by that name, and their maintenance crew hadn't been anywhere near the old field in months. It was as if the dancing man had never existed at all. But I knew what I'd seen that night, and I knew Lee was never coming home. 53 years have passed since then, and I've carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest every single day. I became a machinist, married a good woman named Helen, raised 3 children, and watched them have children of their own. Yet sometimes, on summer evenings, when the air is still and heavy, I find myself thinking about that orange light and the sound of whistling in the dark. I think about Lee Hartwick, who never got his chance to see California, and about the evil that can hide behind a friendly smile and small-town pleasantries. Most of all, I think about the dancing man, and I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next young person foolish enough to venture into his territory alone. Some mysteries are never solved. Some devils never pay for their crimes, but they're never forgotten either. It was the fall of 2019, and my 3 college buddies, Leland, Quentin, and Beau, and I were desperate for a break from our middle-aged responsibilities. After 30 years of marriages, mortgages, and corporate stress, we craved something that would remind us we were still alive. As former astronomy enthusiasts from our university days, we decided on a stargazing trip to recapture that old passion. Quentin had researched the pine barrens of New Jersey, that vast, desolate wilderness stretching across the southern part of the state. Light pollution maps showed it as one of the darkest regions on the East Coast. We'd rented a cabin near Chatsworth, about 20 miles from our chosen observation site deep in the Barrens. That Friday evening, we loaded our SUVs, my Suburban and Bose F-150, with expensive amateur telescopes, camping chairs, and enough coffee to fuel an all-nighter. The 4-hour drive from our suburban lives felt like a pilgrimage back to simpler times when we'd spent nights on the university observatory roof, young and fearless. The final stretch into the Pine Barrens was unsettling. Narrow sand roads twisted through scrub pines and cedar swamps, the headlights carving through an oppressive darkness. Wild stories about the Jersey Devil and vanished hikers felt less ridiculous out here. We used CB radios to stay connected between vehicles. Cell service was non-existent. Around 11 p.m., we reached our clearing, a small meadow surrounded by stunted pines. The sky was magnificent. Stars blazed like diamonds against black velvet. We set up our equipment with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, decades ago. For 30 minutes, we lost ourselves in Saturn's rings and the Orion Nebula, feeling 22 again. Then Leland's voice crackled over the CB from the F-150. "Cliff, you see those headlights?" My stomach dropped. I turned to see a faint glow creeping along the trail we'd entered on. Out here, miles from civilization at 11 p.m., nobody was just passing through. Whoever was coming meant trouble. "Flash them," Bo suggested from my passenger seat, his engineer's mind seeking logical solutions. "See what they want." I hit the Suburban's high beams 3 times. An old Chevy pickup, rust-eaten and battered, stopped about 50 yards away. No honk, no wave. Then we saw them, 2 figures stepping out, standing motionless in our glare. "This doesn't feel right," Quentin's voice came through the static. At 54, he'd developed good instincts about people. "Let's relocate." We agreed over the radios to find another spot, setting a rule. If those lights followed us, we'd head straight back to the cabin. We packed quickly and took a side trail, reasoning that anyone following us definitely had bad intentions. 3 miles in, we found another clearing and set up again, nerves on edge. 5 minutes later, Leland's urgent voice cut through the radio static. "They're back." Those same headlights pierced the darkness, much closer now. Then came something that made my blood freeze, a deliberate engine rev, like a threat. In my 52 years, I'd learned to trust my gut, and it was screaming danger. "We're leaving, now," I commanded. We scrambled into our vehicles. I gunned the Suburban over roots and ruts, Bo gripping the dashboard as branches scraped the sides. Those headlights stayed locked on us, high beams flooding my mirrors. 20 miles from help, 4 middle-aged guys with families waiting at home. This wasn't an adventure anymore. "Bo, status?" I called into the CB. "Right behind you," came his reply. "These bastards are on our tail." The trail forked ahead, and I swerved right, praying it led to the main road. The pickup followed relentlessly. They weren't trying to catch us. They were hurting us, playing with us, and that realization was worse than speed. For 15 terrifying minutes, we raced through the Pine Barrens, our expensive SUVs bottoming out on sand roads while that ancient pickup stayed impossibly close. Finally, blessed asphalt appeared ahead, and a highway sign materialized in our headlights. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting those headlights, but they were gone. Vanished. Bo's F-150 pulled up beside me on the highway shoulder, and we sat there panting, staring back into the black forest. The only sounds now were cicadas and the crackle of our CBs. The drive back to the cabin was silent, each of us lost in thought. We locked the doors and checked the windows. Habits learned from decades of protecting families. Even our safe rental felt violated by what we'd experienced. Who were they? Poachers protecting illegal hunting grounds? Drug runners using the barrens for smuggling? Or something tied to the darker legends of this place? At our age, we knew that people who stalked strangers in remote areas at midnight weren't playing pranks. The way they'd watched us, the calculated pursuit, it wasn't random. They'd wanted us afraid, wanted us to know we were powerless out there. We never went back. We don't discuss it, not with our wives, not with anyone. But sometimes, driving those quiet, suburban streets at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror more than I used to. Some lessons from middle age stick with you. There are still things in this world that can make grown men feel like helpless boys, and wisdom is knowing when to run. The pine barrens keep their secrets, and we were content to let them.